Okay, so here's a quick overview of version control using TortoiseSVN for Unity. If you don't use version control, you probably should. You will at some stage if you've lost or a project because it got corrupted, or you made a stupid mistake and you can't get back to it, or you imported an asset and it broke everything, then you'll be glad that you've got a version control. A lot of people use GitHub. The problem with GitHub is unless you're paying for it, I think you only get about 1 gig on of storage. Also, until very recently, like a couple of weeks ago, if you had a free account, then your projects weren't private. So if you were using third-party assets, you were probably inadvertently uploading copyrighted material, making it available to everyone. I find GitHub quite difficult to get my head around, but I guess it's just what you know. So I'm just going to explain what I use, which is TortoiseSVN, which is slightly different. It uses the SVN subversion system as opposed to Git, which is just a kind of idiosyncrasies of each. Google it if you're interested in the difference. What I really like about Tortoise is I can essentially, so on a normal storage drive, I've got my repositories. Make sure I'm going to the right place. Repos, there you are. So these are all my Tortoise SVN repositories. They're the backups of my most important projects. They're the ones that I get back to. And then I'm working on a fast SSD for the actual projects themselves. And these ones that have got this check mark, that they're the ones that are version controlled. So tick means what's in the working directory. So in this version, this folder is equally copied, and let's open both folders at the same time. Open a new window. I'll make it easier to see what's happening. So the ones that have got a tick, so nature environments, there's the master copy. So every time I make a change in this project, this is just a Unity project, and commit, I'll show you how to do that. All the data, everything gets copied over into here, and until I commit, for example in this Oracle's prototype, I've not committed, so there's some changes in here that aren't copied over there yet, and that's what that exclamation mark is telling me. This is not being pushed to the repo. Now, why have it local? So GitHub just by default sends it to the cloud. It's because it's local to me. I like to have, my own local copies of everything. So I've got 2 backups. I've got one on my F drive, which is the fast working drive. I've got just a bog standard IDE drive, slow for the main backups, and then I back this up using Backblaze, so a kind of a storage to the cloud, so that saves it offsite. And actually I also make a copy of pretty much all my drives using Acronis to a USB drive. So I've got 1, 2 cloud, 4 copies of everything all at the same time. And if you've ever lost data and hard drives have failed on you, you'll probably should be doing something similar to what I'm doing. So that's the big picture. It show you how to set it up for Unity. So you go to the TortoiseSVN website, in downloads, and get the latest for your operating system, and you just install it pretty much like any, and it installs as a shell program. So as you could see, I start right clicking, Tortoise is there, and then that's kind of key. So it's think of it as part of your operating system in a way it's running. So I've got a basic project. The first and only thing that you need to do in terms of getting ready for TortoiseSVN is go into project settings, editor, and then make sure that for version control the mode is visible meta files. That's it. Now it's recommended that at this stage you close Unity and then start it up again. so that everything just gets reloaded with those new settings. Okay, and we're done. So I've got a very basic project. I mean, I hardly need to show you what it is. Essentially it's some primitives, and I've got a cube. Actually that speed is, let's give it a bit of speed, so 91. So let's go, actually let's make it an even 100. Let's pull these into prefabs. Save the scene. So if I close this and open our repo folder, first thing to do is you create a new folder and you'll call it whatever you want. So I'll call it test project. It's just a normal folder. I right click on this, TortoiseSVN, create repository here. So it's asking, it said it's created the repository. Do I want to create the folder structure or start the repo browser? Now SVN by default uses a specific structure for folders based on this idea of trunks, branches and tags. If you're just kind of starting on version control, don't worry about it, apart from say yes, do create the folder structure and then work in trunk. Trunk is your main working directory. Branches and tags are pretty much identical. Actually, it's just how you decide to use them. But the idea is once you've got, I say, a release version that you're happy with and you want to essentially create a kind of a standalone copy of that that you can always go back easily, then you would branch it, and then whether or not you want to then take your branch and turn it into a tag is up to you, but that's slightly more advanced stuff. But think of your trunk as your main working copy, and if you just only ever do your work in trunk, that's fine. So I do want that basic folder structure. It's been created, great. So do you want to start the repo browser? You don't actually need to. I will, just to show you actually what's going on, because something to bear in mind is you should never use Windows Explorer to go through these repos, these repositories. They're not, I mean, they're real folders, but they contain all sorts of weird data. The only way that you should ever really look at this, the information, the data inside these folders, is through the repository browser. But actually you won't really ever need to be doing this, but at least you can see that you've got these trunks and these, I mean, they're all, everything's empty, but these folders were essentially created for you. I'm going to take a copy of this because this is going to be important for us in a second. So we're done here pretty much. Now let me open my other folder, the actual folder where we've got hide away some of my game icons so they're not too much of a distraction. Okay, so this is, are we still in D? Yeah, we're in D. This is not where we want to be. We want to be in our project. It's not on F, it's on G. Okay, so that's the test project. That's the place that we've been working in. And what I want to do is I want to go import. So this is the first part of it. This is currently, this test project is not under version control, but I now want to import it into the repository. So think of your repository, they've got a little icon, it's a little yellow cylinder. So we're going into the repository. We're going to import our project and put it into a repository so it starts being version controlled. So where's it going to go into? Actually, it's, remember that I copied that file D repos test project trunk, and do go into trunk. As I mentioned, that's your main working directory, so make sure that you're going into trunk, not into just project. And part of version control, which is useful, is having a little bit of you know, every time you commit, every time you make a save to the repository, you can write a message about what that was. So I'm just going to say initial commit. That's the first version. But if you don't want to leave messages, you don't have to, but they're kind of useful. So you can go right off and say, right, add all of this, and you can see it, and it pops up that window, and it's going add. This search stage, while it's doing its stuff, I mean, there's not too much going on, but you can see that it's adding stuff in the from the library folder, from project settings. Most of what we took was kind of this odd metadata from the library. Okay, and the VS folder, which is Visual Studio. Do we want that? Actually, no. So this is a little bit about folder structures in Unity. If you want to make a copy of a project, really all you need is your assets and your project settings. I tend to copy those as well. More recently, the Unity Package Manager is useful, especially in 2018. I think it keeps tabs on what packages are installed. This is just a JSON file. The packages themselves aren't in there. It's just a file. So there's no harm in including that. But the .vs, this kind of metadata related to Visual Studio, don't need it. The library definitely don't need it. It has all your shader cache. It's got an awful lot of data that you don't need. Now, one of the useful things about SVN, TortoiseSVN, is it allows you to add an ignore pattern. So you can say, you know, anything that ends in a .o extension, anything that ends in a .lo extension, whatever these are. So many of them come as defaults, but there are some that you'll need to add yourself. Not sure if I remember adding DS store, which would be, you know, information from a Mac. Unity Proj, that's something that I have added. Star SLN, yeah, definitely. The user prefs, all that stuff which is not useful. And the temp directory is often turning up. Now I've got VS Code here, but I haven't got VS. I'm going to add that to my global ignore, because it's not a folder that I'll ever want to version control. It's not necessary. These things get rebuilt in the same way that the library, if you had to start from scratch, everything in the library would get rebuilt when you loaded it up. But now you might decide, oh, actually I should add the library folder here. The problem I found was, if you do that, and I've noticed on the net some people do recommend to add it, is the problem is if you've got an asset, say, you know, in your actual project itself, which is maybe has a folder called library, which I had on a certain project, which was, I can't remember, like a medieval interiors package, and there was a folder called library. It ignored that folder. It didn't back up the files inside, because these global ignore patterns will ignore it across any repository, across, you know, any of these, any project. And although you don't want this specific library project, you do want a folder inside your assets if it happens to be called library. So I'm not much of an SVN expert. There might be a way of saying only ignore the library project in the root, but do version control it in assets. But I've not found a way of doing that, so I'll show you my workaround. So I don't add library here, but I will add .vs. So done. Now we've put everything into project. If you want to double check, you can use that repo browser that we had before. And now if you go inside trunk, there you are, you can see we've got all the projects, all the folders and all the files that we're expecting to see, and it includes the meta file. That's what we turned on earlier on by making them visible. Why do you make them visible? Well, if you don't, they do get recreated. The problem is they contain a very specific ID, and you're not guaranteed that when they're recreated that the IDs will be the same as what you had before, and then you can start having things like missing scripts or missing references to assets. So that's the reason for making those visible and including them in your version control. So our stuff is in this test project and it came from here, but this folder, see, doesn't have the icon. It's not under version control. So how do you get a version control copy of this? Quite simple. You go to the repository, SVN checkout. Yeah. So read what it's telling you. The repository, what's the URL? URL of repository, file test project. And remember, what we actually want to get out is what's in trunk. So let's add trunk. If you don't add trunk, you'll end up with, actually there's a good example. If I'm looking in here looking for the folder structure that I mentioned, it's not there. If you want to look at the folder structure, you look at the repo browser. So if I don't include trunk, I'll end up with branches, tags and trunk. Actually, I just want what's inside of here. So remember to add trunk. And where do I want to save it to? So where am I checking out to? I'm checking the stuff out of here and I'm putting it in there. So I want to go into here. I'm going to Unity projects, and what do we call it? A test project. Now you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't exist, this folder, yet, and just by convention, WC, it tends to be added to the end, and WC stands for working copy. So we're going to grab the data out of here. It's going to come into a new folder called a test project underscore WC, which is the working copy. So you'll be working in here, and then when you make a change and you're happy with it, you send it back to the repository. So that's what, by convention, underscore WC. And you can leave everything else. Head revision is the first revision. You could, if you wanted to, after you've been working on a project and you've got to say revision 2 or 3 or 15 or whatever, you can say, actually, I just want to grab that copy of what's in the repository at a specific revision, but we're taking the initial head revision, so that's what we want to do. Okay, let's do this, and it's going to grab everything, and you can see it already doing its stuff, and it's done. It completed at revision 2. Revision 1 was the import. Revision 2 is the coming back, and you'll notice these revisions just keep going up. You don't need to worry about the numbers, but you know that it's happening. So what have we got? A project underscore WC, the working copy, which is synchronized essentially with the repository. That's under version control. This one was our original. If you want to be careful about these things, you could keep this somewhere, keep it safe. Actually, you don't need it anymore, but that's entirely up to you. I mean, for my project. So the very first thing is I want to tidy up some of what's going on. There's an SVN folder. Don't delete that. If you've got if you've got turn on hidden files like I have, don't delete that. So the very first thing that I want to do is unversion and add to ignore list. So that's what I want to do. The exact difference between recursively and not, I'm still not sure yet. I tend to go with this one. I have a feeling recursively means throughout the kind of down through the folders. Actually, for .vs probably would make sense to make it recursive if there happen to be more .vs folders later on, but I don't think there are. So I'm going to go just here. So it's been added to the ignore list, and you remember I was going to do the same thing with the library. So unversion and add to ignore list library. I definitely don't want, you probably can't see, actually let me move this across so you can see. There this recursively. Definitely you don't want this one to be recursive, because that's what we were avoiding by making it global. If there's a folder in your assets that happens to be called library, then it would be ignored as well. It's just this one library folder in this one place that I want to unversion and add to the ignore list for this project. So we made a couple of changes. We've essentially unversioned these bits, so it's a good time to go up a level to the root of that project. There's the exclamation mark. You've made some changes. Commit. So SVN commit means it's going into the repository. SVN update would be taking from the repository into your working copy. It's for collaborative working, for example. If you're doing some work with other people and they're sharing the same repository, then you kind of update your copy before you start your day's work, so you make sure that you've got everybody's work, you know, so you're up to date. If you're working kind of a solo dev, you don't so much need update. It's mostly about committing. So you've made a change in your working copy. Now I want to commit that change. So let's see what we've got going on. It knows a few things, and it tells you, you know, keep an eye on what it's actually telling you. These pop-up windows from TortoiseSVN are informative. It's telling me I've got all these files, .vs, and in the library as well. They've all been deleted. They've been deleted not from my working copy, they've just been deleted from the repository because we've stopped keeping them under version control. So what I'm going to write in my message is unversioned Visual Studio and unversion project library. And that's it. So I'm happy with that. Okay, so it's gone through, it's committed the transaction, and we're at revision 3. Okay, and we've now got a tick. Great. And you can see these are no longer being versioned. There's no tick next to them. So let's go back to you actually just kind of you actually no longer need to worry yourself about the repo now. So actually I'm going to close it. We open Unity. It doesn't have the project that we had before, so you need to open your working copy now. This is now your new project, and it opens as you would expect. It's just a normal project, no different. You do your stuff. So yeah, fine. So we got our rotating cube, let's say, for example. So the rotation is just a script. If I do, actually I'm going to do I'm going to do it on a new just opening up Visual Studio. Let me show you what's going on. Not a rocket science. Just going to change the axis of this rotation, and I need to, what did I call it? Z. Update the class. Save. Okay. So I'm going to go on the cylinder, and the reason is I couldn't reuse this one because it was rotating on the y-axis, and you weren't going to see it on a cylinder. So yeah, it's moving, but moving really slowly. So let's give it some speed. Yeah, 200. Great. So we've made a change. Hey, why not? Let's add something else like quad. Save. And do you have to close it? Possibly, possibly not. I think it's probably a good idea. So I tend to, you know, I do my day's work, I do what I need to do, then at the end of the work that I've done, I think, right, I've done some work, I'm going to commit those. I'm happy with those changes, and it's a state in which if there's something goes wrong, I want to be able to come back to this. Tend to do it daily, I would recommend it, or if there's a big change. So for example, version control is really useful. I mentioned earlier on, if you're going to make if you're going to import an asset that you're not unsure about, that may break things, make a commit beforehand. So can't remember, we rotated cylinder, and so yeah, I sorry, I slightly went a bit fast there. I went on over it and I pressed SVN commit, popped up this window. I've given it a name, so I've given this commit a bit of a, not a name, a description. You can add as much as you want in here, and then it shows you, okay, so what's happened, what changes were made. The scene has changed and it's been modified. That's the status. And then there's more going on. There are a couple of files have been added. They're non-versioned, and all you need to do is, obviously if they're ones that you do want a version, but most of the time you do, just make sure they're ticked. You might be working on a big project, there's lots and lots of files. You can just select all of them, so you know, select the first one, shift click, select the bottom one, and then just tick on one of them. That will tick all of them. You don't have to go tick 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 tick. I want to add them, and before you press the commit, you want to go right click on those selected files and go add, which also points me to an important fact, which is the delete. But the delete I tend not to do in this window. You can if you want to, but I'll show you where it's better to use delete when you're doing it. But new files, they're non-version, you select them, you say, right, I want you to add them. Now they change to this added status, and go OK. So we've completed our transaction, our commit. You know, you don't have to go through reading all of this. It becomes pretty painless, you know, and effortless after a while. You're just going, right, done. As long as it says it's OK, you're good to go. And now we've got a tick, and if I open the project again, it's just a file like any other. So let me think of an instance of you might want to do a delete. I'll make a dud file, and we'll need to commit it, because otherwise, so dud for whatever. This could be an image, could be a script, or whatever. You decide, actually I don't need it. One of the problems with version control is if it's been committed, let's say it has, we'll close that. So sometimes you'll see, oh, it's still ticked. Now it's ticked because currently, until you tell it to commit, it won't know that there's a new file in scripts. This is unversioned. They're all ticked. That's unversioned. So the actual, as far as the root is concerned, well, I don't know about this file. It's not in my version control. But if as soon as I go commit, then it will find it. So I'm going to just adding dud file. Select them. Add, automatically ticks them for you. Actually, I forgot about that. And then add, so it's added those. Now if I decide I'm not sure about those files, you can, it's recommended generally that you don't delete them from the project, but actually I find it works okay, and I'll show you, because otherwise the traditional, I'll show you the kind of the official by the book version of doing version control is you go to the file, you right click, TortoiseSVN, delete. You're telling the version control system you want to delete those, and then so it knows something's missing, so you might decide, right, commit deleted those files and go OK. So we're now at revision 6. But you realize, oh no, I made a mistake. Now revert to revision. So update to review. You want to say, actually, I made a mistake. I want to go back. So it's saying, at what revision do you want to go? You can open the log and it'll start telling you, then that's where these messages come in. Or where did I delete that? Oh, I added the dud files at 5. I did the rotate cylinder at 4. So show you the whole window. Actually, I think 5 is going to be the one. So I pressed OK. Now it knows I want revision 5 because I want those files back. So OK, added dud and dud meta. They're back. If I open Unity again, dud file is back. But it's show you the other way. So I've shown you the official way. What happens if, say, you bring in an asset? These are just a couple of actually grass textures. Yeah, grass textures. And you brought them in. You just committed them. So grass, and I have to add them. Done. And you've done, you know, some more work, and then you decide as you're working, oh, actually, I'm not sure if I'm going to need grass there anymore. You're just tidying up. You see, you can delete them from here, and then on your next commit, you know, not immediately, but on the next commit, when you're just doing your end of the day commit, you'll see all the updates that you've made, but you'll also notice that those are missing. And then it's at that stage that you would just go, you know, so work I did today, and then one of them you might say deleted unneeded grass or whatever, you know. And that's the case where you would select both, delete, changes their status to deleted, and then OK that, and then along with all the other commits that you might have, in fact, just for the sake of I'll change the scene just for the sake of actually showing you actually what you're more likely to have. So you'd have some files are modified. That one I've already marked as deleted, but if it hadn't been already, it would show, as I explained, as missing. Right click, and so if you change your mind, you can add them back. But no, I'm good to mark those missing files as deleted. And so my day's work, deleted grass, and then OK that. And then it's those files are gone for good from the repository. They're obviously already deleted because you deleted them. That grass file is already deleted from the project folder. So although traditionally, you know, the official way is you really should be deleting inside here, but you might decide, well, I'll delete that prefab, and the official way would be to delete via the TortoiseSVN interface within the actual folders. You can get away with deleting in your project. Just make sure that you, when you commit, you mark the missing ones as deleted, and then it will do an update for you. Very much in a similar way that if you say you import an asset store package and it comes into your folder, as I did when I brought in the grass folder, I have just imported a sky asset. So, you know, anything like that, on your commits, you'll notice those as being unversioned. So any new packages that you install, they'll all appear as unversioned, and then you need to make sure that you add them and OK that. Sometimes you see this additional pop-up appears, especially if it's a very big package. You'll just run through as an additional process, so it's add finished, but that doesn't mean it's committed yet, it's just changed the status, and then you commit it. So I've imported Sky package or whatever it is, and OK, and then it does its commit and you're good to go. And that's about it. I mean, it's a great safety net. So for example, you've done this work and you think, I want to try something different, I want to do a different branch. That's where the branches come in. So you can say, okay, so I want to make a copy of what's in the trunk, so my working copy, and I want to go not back to the trunk, I want to go into branch. Let me double check I've got the terminology right. In the repos, repo browser, oh, branches, yeah, good thing I checked. So to path branches, this is, I don't know, version 1 initial release. Specific revision, yeah, that's good. Or you could say working copy, but if you're not sure, just click the open log and you can, it shows you, yeah, that's the latest one. That's good. So branches already exist. Of course, I need to give it a name. So it's not enough just to say copy this folder to branch. So in my usual style, it's good that you see me making these errors because you might do it yourself. So you want to say I'm going into the folders branches and I'm going to call it version 1. Say for example release. So this is initial release. Specific 6, yeah. So that was the bit that I was missing. Actually telling it belongs in a folder because it's going to be it's going to have its own. It's a folder all of itself in the repository, and you can always go back to it if you need to. And it's telling you some important stuff. So your working copy remains intact on the previous path. You're still using that WC. That's still where you're going, and that's still going into trunk, and that's not going to change. If you really want to change, you start using this switch command, just switching to different branches. That's more advanced stuff, and you can kind of see it from this folder, this idea of you're able to branch, try a few things out, and maybe merge back into the main development. That's kind of more advanced version control, but just to give you a kind of a taster of the power that it gives you, this idea of creating a branch, and then you can do things like, so you've done some work and you need to get back to what you had before. Well, we've done this checkout already, so I'm going to SVN checkout, and now you might say, actually I want to check out from, so if you can't see what you need, you can open the browser using these little dots. So I want to check out V1 release, that branch, and I'm going to save it to where have we been working in here, G, and it's going to go to, oh, so let's make it what it is. So test project, was it? Yeah, test project initial release. And where do you want to? So you could say a specific revision or the head revision. Head revision for that branch is just the commit, but there might be versions within the branch, but actually for us head is fine. So off it goes, it's done all its thing, and if I open that, you can see now we've got a folder with our initial release, and it's got the, and there's a good example of the library folder. It's not there because it's not under version control. So if you open this, it will recreate all of that but you've got the project settings and you've got the Unity manager. Now, a little tip: if you don't want to have to recreate, if you've got a really big project, you don't want the library to be recreated, but you're working as I am, you've got your main working copy and then this kind of initial release, and you know that they're more or less the same, you can try, you know, copying the library folder over, but it's up to you. If you want a really clean initial, you want to be sure it's going to work, just open that in Unity. I mean, hey, let's do it, you'll see what I mean. It just takes a little bit more time to load on a really big project. So we got initial release, select, and there you are, library being recreated, temp being recreated. It's recreating all the stuff. Now it's brand new, so it doesn't remember everything what you had last loaded, but the, you know, your project is still there. And there you are. That's a whirlwind tour of version control. I hope it's useful. It uses TortoiseSVN, and I'm using 2017. I think 2018 is slightly different in terms of its folder structure, but not drastically so, actually. So I think you'd be okay using the same, certainly the same workflow. I think where you might start hitting some issues is if you use, what I'll do is I'll make my settings, I'll make my global ignore pattern available to you so you can use that. I didn't have .vs previously because I've only just started using Visual Studio. I was using VS Code before. Something to watch out for, just as a final kind of sign off, that I've seen some global ignore patterns include DLL. I would highly recommend not, and the reason for that is increasingly a lot of assets being sold as DLLs, so they're not C# files, and that it means you lose them. And there's a couple of extra similar ones that mean that if you're doing, say, VR development, those plugins don't get installed or don't get version controlled. So Google VR SDK, Rift, Resonance, or no, it's Google Resonance Audio, but whatever the Rift version of Resonance Audio, or Oculus version of Resonance Audio, it was another one that I found wasn't being backed up with a kind of more traditional ignore pattern. So maybe use mine as a starting point, then you can always add ones that you need as you go, and as you learn more about using version control. Hopefully I've given you a feel for it being fairly easy and not as scary, I guess, as it might first appear. Just this process of, at the end of your working day, go to your root of your working directory and just commit, give a bit of text about, I mean, I've got no commits to add now, there are no files changed, but a little bit of text, and you notice, you know, in this log history is really useful. It will keep tags on what your work is, and you can go back to various stages if something goes really drastically wrong. So I've shown you how to get back your branch. If, for example, you made a really big mess to this project and you wanted a brand new working copy, and the process is exactly the same. You could just go right click, and you can actually do it anyway. You don't need to open. One of the things I've been doing is doing this and clicking on the, you can do SVN, but you can actually do it from anywhere. You can say on here, I want to do an SVN checkout. You'll just need to make sure that you remember what your the URL to the repository was, so what the file path to the repository is, because it'll remember all the other ones that you've been working on, and it will just show the latest one. But as you can see, I'm working on a couple of, well, 2 or 3 different projects, so they've each got their own repository. But you could just then say, okay, so I want, you know, working copy 2, and then you can do some work on that. So that's when you're essentially getting back from the repository the entire project. But what happens if you do a change that you want to revert on just a single file, for example? So the kind of things that might happen in your day-to-day work, you know, you might start making changes, move things around. If I save that and I can commit, so it sometimes takes a little bit of time for this icon to update, just be aware. So just going to commit that scene, so I've moved things around, updated, and then maybe it might move that and then turn all of that blue, so apply that. Save the scene, so that's another change. I might commit at the end of my working day, so sphere, and you'll notice it knows what's in your project, so that can be useful. It just gives you this kind of IntelliSense type of thing going on. So I made the changes. What happens if, so actually let me make some more changes to the scene, for example. Move that back here. Close Unity this time. And okay, so moved again. So what about if I think that's committed. I think it's just taking its time updated. Yeah, just what really matters is what the pop-up tells you. So for example, you've decided, oh, I made a mistake, I want to revert back this scene. So you can just right click on it and update to revision. So that scene, actually, oh, I made a mistake, I want to go back to the one when so either the scene as I wanted it, which I think was the commit that I've made when everything was back in place. Let's go back to that. Go, okay, so I want to go back to that revision. Okay, and so on my PC you'll notice sometimes Tortoise just starts showing these icons in places that it's not being version controlled. It's just one of those things you have to live with. That I'm not sure if it affects everyone or not. So it's put back all the objects as they were originally, but you'll notice that the prefabs, they've not been updated because the prefabs are different assets. But say if the other kind of thing that might happen, so if you make that one red and apply the prefab, in fact I don't even need to close Unity to do this, you can do it on the fly. If I go up and you'll notice the prefab, so I haven't committed. So what I did in the scene is it had been committed, so I needed to go update to revision. And by the way, if you're say working on lots of things, you could select a whole folder and update the folder to revision as well. That's useful. But on an individual item, if it's not being committed, you've got the option to go, oh, that was a mistake or something's gone really wrong, just grab it back, and what you want is then just revert. So I can just revert that cube. Yeah, and if I just open Unity again, it's reverted back to its blue color. So that's how you would kind of handle changes, maybe to an entire scene or a few scenes before, or a few states before I should say, because it's not just to do with scenes. You could revert to revision on a script. That often will happen. But also if you've just made a mistake and before it's been committed, you can just revert it back to what you need it to be. I hope that's useful.